Don't drop the mic. Chapter 4. Find the joint from whom the whole body fitly joined together by that which every joint supplieth according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, maketh increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 16. I understand that the title of this chapter might mean different things to different people. To the cook, it conjures images of cutting chicken quarters apart. To the surgeon, it might mean examining an x-ray to research the tissue surrounding a patient's kneecap. To the street thug, it may mean finding a supplier who has marijuana for sale by the joint. If he's arrested, he will be incarcerated in the joint, street slang for prison. Obviously, none of these meanings conveys what the apostle who wrote these words had in mind. Instead, he alleges that the body of Christ is edified through the power of connectivity. So, let's focus on his meaning and leave the rest for others to explore. No matter the venue or occasion, all communicators want connection with their audience. Every great comedian knows it. Every public speaker seeks it. Everyone from talk show hosts to YouTube entertainers, TED talkers to life coaches, political pundits to romance novelists seeks to connect with the broadest array of people. You never want to miss opportunities for the kind of personal alignment required to bond with your audience. In fact, every preacher knows the sinking, gut-wrenching, nauseating feeling that drops to the pit of your stomach when 10 minutes into your presentation you realize that you're not connecting with your audience. The sermons seem to last twice as long for everyone present. Context of conversation. My connection to my listeners reflects the intersection of where I've been and where they're going. I'm aware that my perspective reflects my experience, ethnicity, the Appalachian Mountain culture that incubated me, my posture in my home as a patriarch, and my gender through which I've experienced the world. I was raised in the Baptist church, which also influenced me as a communicator, both as an observer and as a participant. While this church shares theological similarities with the Southern Baptist domination and other predominantly white evangelical movements, it isn't wise to see them as totally homogeneous. There is a great deal in difference in focus, form, and priorities. Coupled with the fact that my early years of preaching were shaped and trained by Pentecostal icons, my religious and spiritual experiences deposited an understanding of the scriptures as well as the objective of the preaching moment. Both the African American experience, along with the oppression of Pentecostal people, affects the tenor and tone of how we speak about preaching in general. African American pastors often rely on a call and response method that takes a preaching moment from a monologue of truth expounded to a dialogue of truth, shared and experienced. How is any of this related? The answer speaks to what I think of as the communicative context of conversation. To comprehend the milieu of preaching as I know and practice it, you must understand the social, cultural, economic, and spiritual dynamics of the African Americans who made their brutal passage from East Africa to the shores of this great country. Simply put, we entered into the American dream while still in the deep sleep of an African nightmare. All that we are and all that we have experienced are all that we have to bring to the podium. It is the lens through which we see a text or an issue. We all endeavor to be objective, but people inevitably, irrepressibly bring all that they are, how and what they communicate. The shaded lenses of our background and history color all that we bring to our study. Whether you are talking hip hop or poetry, comedy or the novelization of a saga told over generations, all that we have to bring is the sum total of all that we are or have experienced. To separate someone's history from their ideas and approach is nearly impossible. Ultimately, such separation would sanitize the delivery from all that would make us unique, from those who only seek to influence the convictions of the crowd rather than to impart truth from relationships that elicits the call and response of our African background. Let me say it another way. It isn't uncommon to get spontaneous commentary from the pews. Say it, preacher! And amen, brother! And come on with it! Are merely representatives of all other reactions blurted out during the preaching moment when a connection exists. These comments are more than emotional outbursts. They are the results of the journey we took that leads us into a deeper understanding of shared truths. Such responses and all other auditory moments from the hearer to the speaker acknowledge our connectivity to that audience. This background reflecting ministry and it is message as both theologists and therapists of a traumatized constituency colors the way we understand the experience of and with the microphone. For almost 400 years, we survived in a sociological construct that stabilized and often anesthetized the pain of an oppressed people, which explains why the principles espoused are co-equal with the needs of the people we serve. So then, from our cultural perspective, the messenger is responsible for the spiritual and emotional well-being of those listening. To deny this part of our discussion is to ignore the intent of the message and the origin of the purpose of preaching. Your secret weapon. The late comedian and actor Bernie Mac, in his book, Maybe You Never Cry Again, explains that he became a comedian because he witnessed at an early age how comedy can have such a powerful impact. He watched his mother go from crying about her life to laughing hysterically at the comedic delivery of then popular Bill Cosby. Bernie Mac's attraction wasn't fortune or fame. Instead, his attraction to comedy was the power that the mic gave. The realization that it was indeed possible for comedy to alleviate the weeping souls of people by providing lighthearted relief. Intent, then, at least in this example, shaped the perceived objective of the comedian. Much like preaching, at least for Bernie, was the power to alleviate the pain of life with the power of laughter. All other factors, centered around the delivery, synchronized in the underlying motive of being medicinal by creating an experience that tranquilizes pain with hope. and laughter. If applied to speaking in general, we discover the essential relationship between experience and relevance. It is nearly impossible to move an audience with something that you are not moved by yourself. Love is the secret weapon of great speaking. Since I am a son and a father, a husband and a brother, most of who I am is predicated upon my relationships. I suggest to you that personal connections are the greatest resource to the speaker. Relationships offer something more akin to cross pollination than just impartation, which in turn affects the outcome of how we define success. Additionally, the role of clergy has a different objective when communicating to a people who had never had a president who looked like them until the last decade. Instead, we had the sage voices of the preachers, who were seen as professionals and community leaders at the time. This is also true of how we see and saw teachers. They were seen as professionals at a levels they should be, but sometimes are not so regarded today. Our teachers' communication styles often became the catalyst for more than just the information assimilated in their lesson plans. They planted seeds of personal development and aspirational growth. Yes, most teachers had the same textbook, but the truly great ones augmented the cold and sterile facts of each page by engaging the students in unique and abstract ways to make the subject more salient in different settings for different age groups. I can remember my mother working as a teacher, and she often spent long hours developing lesson plans to engage and stimulate her students. Her focus on reading them, on reaching them, informed her selection of teaching tools, and these, too, harmonized with her awareness of the demographics of her classroom. Compass for community. Throughout our nation's history, the sermon has been the compass that guided our community at large to enlightenment. From voices like the Reverend Jesse Jackson, Dr. Martin Luther King, from Frederick Douglass to Harriet Tubman, who, while not a preacher, was believed to receive messages from God that led her through her fight as an abolitionist. Her example illustrates the multiple facets of a gifted communicator. Almost without exception, the voices that led us were the same voices that fed us on Sunday morning. Therefore, there is an expectation in our community for those who rise to prominence to be called of God in order to achieve impact. Their voices transcend their individual personalities and amplify the internal message of the people for whom they wield the microphone. This phenomenon does not dissipate but creatively evolves. Consider how the birth of hip hop was widely received as the clergy of the street, speaking to and often speaking for the world that informed their perspective. The language was crass and often shocking, but it was often as true as the account of any journalist on the scene, reporting what happened, what it means, and how we should view where we are in life at any given moment. While huge distinctions remain between traditional preaching and performing hip hop, both were unexpected to, tell it like it is, rather than to wax philosophical with feel good platitudes. Neither group was lauded for espousing principles over people. Hip hop isn't the only genre reflecting this approach. Countless musicians, songwriters, performers, and producers often accepted the task to create ground level works, reordering public perception of what's true. The 60s birthed voices like the great James Brown and his bold message, "I'm black and I'm proud." Marvin Gaye's classic, "What's Going On?" as relevant now as it was when released in 1971, assumed responsibility for the voiceless while articulating the dissonance felt by generations of people who dared question established delusions. Along with many other talented artists, they rose to prominence from inside the community in which they were first inspired. They accepted the responsibility, both unspoken and spoken, to use their influence and artistry to further an agenda that included, but wasn't limited to, speaking up and speaking out for those who propelled them into prominence. Hence, the requisite relationship to the people in the pews, on the dance floor, or in the streets in order to speak for them as much as to them. It isn't enough to have a relationship with God. We must also have a relationship with the people. Our ability to connect with that audience creates trust. As I traveled to address various audiences, I quickly learned it's not enough to connect with the substance of my message and ignore how my audience will receive it. Without studying my intended audience, I would miss synergistic points of connectivity. Knowing as much as possible about my audience is integral to my delivery, for me. That research begins when I accept the engagement and consider what the letter of invitation reveals about my prospective listeners. It continues by observing who picks me up at the airport, how I am accommodated, as well as all the music, messaging, and speaking that preceded my address. Again, communication is a distillation of relationships. Your ability to find common ground, points of connectivity, and illustrations that resonate with the crowd is paramount to your success. To be sure, my voice has gone way beyond my blackness to serve the Venezuelan, the Caucasian, the Hispanic, the African, and the European. With each engagement, the event wasn't only about who I spoke to, but rather where I spoke from. Regardless of the diverse people I address, I must never forget who I speak for and the people who helped me climb the ladder to reach my pulpit. Oddly enough, in a society that loves to find distinctions by focusing on what is unique to us, a good speaker is the antithesis of that ideal. You are looking for what unites us, not what divides us. In speaking with anyone or any group of people, connectivity is everything. Charisma connects. All of us have endured those sessions where the person speaking might be knowledgeable about the subject, but listening to them was as interesting as watching paint dry. Charisma, presence, and personality are huge assets when speaking to any group. I started speaking to groups of largely African American church women through a faith based empowerment session I called Women Thou Art Loose. These messages were crafted for my specific audience about spiritual and emotional needs I felt called to address. Later, I did a similar session geared toward men called Manpower. As opportunities to speak increased, I would often have to go from a massive group of women to a room filled with men. Most of the time, connecting with each audience wasn't difficult. Without a doubt, it's easier to connect with people that you live among rather than people with whom you lack similarities and congruencies. That authentic feeling of connection is invaluable. Many times I was able to not only to connect, but also to delve deeply into ultra personal material once the audience had settled into my style and substance. Having said that, I have had groups with whom it felt quite difficult to connect for whatever reason. Those moments were painful for me and for the crowd because it's impossible to hide when you can't find the joint to connect to your crowd. Connectivity is built around finding the right metaphors, shared comedy, or a vernacular to which the audience relates. Jesus did it through the telling of simple parables that became conduits of complex concepts. His storytelling unveiled deeper truths in tangible ways. His audience could access and apply. He modeled the essence of incarnational connectivity by choosing communication strategies that resonated with his audience. Such strategies remain essential if you want your audience to remember the meaning of your message. Developing a speaking strategy that enables the audience to find personal and cultural resonance builds bridges between you. It may be something as simple as family scenarios, cultural similarities, culinary skills, technological jargon, or anything that expresses your common background and goals. Personal points of connection align to create a network of engagement with each individual in your audience. If your past doesn't provide it, your future goals and ambitions might be the joint that connects you with your audience. It could be a common love for country, faith, shared values, or leadership principles that you hold in common. For the most part, understanding the age, the gender, the profession, and political perspectives of those receiving your message helps you deliver it effectively. Seldom do all of those areas provide synergy, but any one of them may be just the thing to break the ice and create a sense of connection and unity with the crowd. It is a big mistake to spend your entire time thinking about where you want to take the crowd or how you want to inspire them, motivate them, or inform them. Those are destination points. But much like using Uber or Lyft or some other transportation service provided through technology, you can't just type in the destination without also including your current location. Connectivity is all about meeting the audience where they are and then taking them where you are trying to go. You can't get them to the destination until you locate their current location and estimate the distance between you. How else can you close the gap between where you're starting with them and where you want to go? Chemistry lesson. Fundamentally, connectivity is more like a science as it is predicated on knowing. The more you know about them, the better chance you have of locating them. But if connectivity is a science, then your chemistry with an audience is more art. Much like a first impression or first date, chemistry is critical. It's less intellectual and more instinctive, less objective and more subjective. Chemistry is far more ambiguous. Not all speakers have the right chemistry to connect with all audiences. You can learn to connect through thoroughly researching the crowd, but chemistry isn't something you can discern from research alone. It is like trying to teach a person to have charisma or charm. I'm not sure such qualities can actually be taught, although they can be encouraged. The science of chemistry relies on chemical reactions, which always results in altered states. When you add one chemical substance to another, one will either alter the color, form, or a precipitate, form a gas, change the odor, or change the temperature. But when we talk about chemistry between people, the reaction becomes a lot harder to explain. It is more of an experience than an explanation. When a man and a woman date, they are trying to see if there is chemistry between them. Their appeal to one another isn't merely based on physical attraction, although this can be a contributing factor. You can meet someone who is very attractive but not feel drawn to them because there is no instinctive reaction. But as you get to know them, your view of them may change, either confirming that there is absolutely no interest in knowing more about them, or tilting toward a revised impression that piques curiosity. People who may not attract you at first glance may end up relating to you in a way that compels you to them magnetically. On the other hand, if the chemistry is not there, you can't fake it. Some people just don't do it for us. It's not merely a matter of sex appeal or positive energy. It also includes how their presence creates a feeling, a change, a comfortability, and a sense of excitement. Few can predict it. Even fewer can explain it. But we all know when it is there and when it is not. Chemistry with your audience often works in similar fashion. Certain types of people resonate better with certain types of groups more than others. Sometimes chemistry can seem mysterious and even arbitrary. Other times you can identify reasons why you're drawn to certain people, just as your audience understands why they enjoy engaging with you. Your message and your style of delivery. I've noticed that chemistry matters a great deal in political campaigns. A candidate's charisma and appeal to her constituents matters. The nature of our electoral process often gains momentum by the charisma of the candidate and how well she communicates. Often, we elect who the people like the most without considering that it is possible to be good at campaigning but not good at leading. This aspect of any democratic political process leaves margin for misappropriation by the charismatic over the competent and qualified. One can be a strong leader, but not be telegenic, gregarious, or authoritative in demeanor. In fact, some of the most brilliant leaders, CEOs, doctors, and managers, don't always interview well or campaign well. Since the end game isn't the interviewing or the campaign, we lose chances to have great leaders or employees simply because they don't always have immediate chemistry with the crowd. This loss occurs when communication relies solely on charisma and chemistry. I remember when my mother was suffering from an illness. One of her doctors had the personality of a doorknob. His bedside manner was blunt and insensitive. He wasn't rude, but simply matter of fact, which resulted in a lack of chemistry with the family. We found him disengaged with how we felt as a family and insensitive to my mother as a person. While he lacked the reassuring, compassionate persona we craved, he was a brilliant surgeon who excelled in the operating room. We nearly replaced him, but after much discussion and some investigation, we decided to keep him in charge of my mother's surgery because we realized that his manner with the family wasn't why he was there. He was there because he was a great surgeon. If you're a speaker, communicator, or performer, however, you must consider chemistry. While doctors and political leaders communicate in order to perform their roles, a communicator's job is to communicate. If you don't have good chemistry with an audience, you can't overlook that and say, but I can do the job. Speaking is the job. In full and candid disclosure, I must admit that I have occasionally addressed the crowd and sensed that I completely lacked the right chemistry for that group. My style, my demeanor, my approach just underscored that I wasn't the right person for them in that setting at that time. It doesn't mean that I wasn't valuable or I didn't have something worthwhile to impart to them. It does mean, as my mother would say, I wasn't their cup of tea. You cannot be all things to all people, especially if it means that you have to pretend to be something that you are not. Simply put, you can't be prepared to win until you can live with the possibility of losing. Testing the waters is better than drowning in the pool. Delivering your brand. No speaker is good in every setting. This is where branding is important. It is important that a speaker not think of themselves in generalized terms of being a speaker. It is important to understand what kind of speaker you are. Like doctors or lawyers, comedians, or even politicians, there has to be a deeper analysis to determine with more specificity the kind of speaker you really are. This self awareness helps you determine so many other decisions related to how, when, why, and to whom you will communicate. Brand development is at its core a promise. People want to know, what do we get when we invite you? What will those in attendance take away from what you communicate? There are some settings where you may not be the best choice for that crowd. The information is there, the interest and compassion are there, but the chemistry may still be off. Like a couple that starts dating. Sometimes you don't discover this deficit until you're in the situation. Don't allow that to make you feel defeated. Make the best of it in the moment and learn all you can from the experience. Let those moments help you find your best audience. Think of it like you would agriculture. Not all plants grow in all climates. Sometimes the soil isn't conducive. Other times the climate isn't right for that type of plant. It's not either of them is wrong or needs to change. It's simply a matter of them not being good together. Awareness of your brand, your setting, and your audience can help you plant the right seeds to yield the thriving harvest. My range of speaking has been extremely diverse. I've spoken to many variations of the faith based crowd. I've spoken before entertainment crowds about various aspects of faith based films. Though the audience may not have been faith based, I've spoken before various American presidents. And I've had the distinguished honor of speaking for the Congressional Black Caucus. I've also spoken in many corporate settings, from the Kenyan National Bank to the good folks at Toyota's corporate office. I've addressed leaders at Microsoft. I've been interviewed on All Things Considered on NPR, and have enjoyed more relaxed fireside type chats with icons such as Oprah Winfrey. I've had the privilege on many occasions to sit with Larry King on Larry King Live, as well as to address a live audience on Dr. Phil's show. In terms of diversity, I've spoken for groups ranging from Pat Robertson's CBN revivals to Operation Push for the Reverend Jesse Jackson. In every case, I sought to add value to the formats I was afforded. I'm not sure what level of impact I actually had in many cases, but my goal was to add value to the opportunity. I sought to contribute perspective and to be true to who I was, while understanding the range of opinions and institutions for which I spoke. While those audiences were quite diverse, their differences did not require putting guardrails on my capabilities like all communicators. Like all communicators, I am flawed and limited, but those flaws and limitations do not diminish my value when I'm in my element. Lanes and limitations. In order to find your best fit, you must consider, what is your element? Every speaker is constrained to varying degrees by the range of their versatility. While we all want to be as versatile as possible, the truth is we all have some limitations. Acknowledging those limitations is the conduit through which we have focus. It is impossible to extend yourself beyond your ability without compromising your authenticity. If you try to be everything, you end up not being anything. How does one determine his or her range? I think that the range of your versatility comes from an honest critique of each experience. It also is derived by exposure to varied settings and attending events beyond your normal gravitational pull to that which is familiar and comfortable. If you want to expand your brand or ignite more dynamic chemistry, then you must do more than preach to your own choir. Self-analysis, coupled with general consensus, helps us to determine range of influence. While I absolutely believe any communicator can grow and improve, and awareness of your strengths and weaknesses often aids in strategic cultivation of those areas where you have the greatest potential for improvement. Such awareness also helps you avoid wasting time and energy in areas with little return for your investment. Accepting your limitation provides containment for potential calamity, while accentuating your strengths reinforces your brand. There are some settings that I prefer to do in an interview format rather than a direct address from the platform, while others I simply decline, either because I have no passion for the subject or recognize the request is beyond my brand. It simply isn't my thing. Sometimes I may care about the subject and still not be the best choice to lead the conversation. Authenticity is something that I simply refuse to compromise. Without always realizing that that's what I was doing at the time, I learned the hard way that conformity not only sabotages my messages, but also results in regrets. Several years ago, I had a dear friend who had an intense and meaningful ministry to teenagers. His passion was infectious, and the stats reflected his powerful impact in reaching this significant demographic. My problem was that I allowed his passion to move me away from my own. He was sure that I would have a huge impact on this stadium filled with these young people, so I agreed to go. Unfortunately, though, I was not well versed in speaking to their demographic. Because I agreed they were an important audience to reach, I accepted my friend's invitation. Even before I stepped on the stage, though, I knew the audience was beyond my bandwidth. They were gracious and polite, but I could not access the points of connection required for compelling communication. I got through it and hoped there was some value for those in attendance, but I learned to listen to my gut more than anyone else's passionate persuasion. As I drove back to my hotel feeling like a dog with his tail stuck tucked between his hind legs, I knew I would not be accepting similar engagements again. The lesson was clear. Just because you believe in a cause doesn't always mean that you are the best person to lead the discussion. Knowing your limitation is indeed a strength in itself. Challenging cultural conventions. In order to understand how to connect with your audience, you must recognize cultural differences and consider how they affect your style and delivery. We frequently identify cultural differences and assume they are stationary boundaries or defensive walls that cannot be climbed. One of my favorite examples has nothing to do with ethnicity or demographics, but simply contextual, cultural conditioning in a microcosm. Have you ever stepped into a crowded elevator and noticed everyone is looking up at the descent of the illuminated floor numbers as if they were waiting for some potential revelation to occur? It's always funny to me because our staring up is really an attempt to avoid the risk of speaking to strangers who prefers to seem oblivious to our presence. Sometimes I play the game and look up too, staring upward like the disciples waiting for Jesus to go up on a cloud. Other times I feel compelled to break the ice with a warm smile and simple greeting, perhaps good evening or beautiful day, isn't it? Most of the time, in those instances, I've witnessed the entire tight cubicle culture relax after holding its collective breath into a pleasant sigh of cheerful exchanges. I'm often amazed to watch how more times than not people quickly chime in with equal levels of brightness, dismissing their mannequin-like grimace for a much warmer, more personal expression, simply because someone had the courage to speak up. Sometimes we perceive certain cultural conditions existing with our prospective audience and assume we can't connect. But please understand that labeling audiences and understanding them purely by cultural labels can be deceptive. I'm often stunned by the false assumptions people make based on labels. Generalities and stereotypes replace actualities and individuals. Not all black people, or white people, or Christians, or Republicans, or Democrats are monolithic. There are so many subsets and sociological and constructs that exist within the broad applications of people groups, and relying on labels will leave you ill prepared to understand the unique nuances of these subsets with our audience. We are often influenced to think of certain people certain ways without ever allowing for the individual group nuances. It is important to understand that not all churches think the same, even within the same denominations. It is equally important to understand that regions affect the culture of an organization as much as any label. Ages and other demographic considerations contribute to the way of an entity functions and feels when you are speaking of its constituents. While they often share core beliefs, within those core beliefs are other strong distinctions worth considering. If you want to find the joint in your speaking opportunity, then know yourself, know your message, know your limitations, and most important, know your audience. Don't drop the mic. Chapter 4, The Joint.